When we think of the Middle Ages, we picture stone castles, shining armor, and epic battles. But surrounding every knight and every king, filling every castle and every cottage, was another world. A world of texture and color, of function and fantasy. It was a world of fabric and fashion. The clothing of the medieval period was not a mere afterthought. It was a language. A person's garments instantly declared their status, their wealth, their profession, and their place in the rigid hierarchy of God's ordered world. The difference between a peasant's coarse, undyed tunic and a queen's crimson silk brocade was the difference between the earth and the heavens. This documentary will unravel that story. We will journey from the simple, functional clothing of the Dark Ages to the impossibly extravagant and bizarre fashions of the 15th century. We will explore the fundamental technologies that underpinned this entire world, the tireless, near-constant work of spinning thread from wool and flax, the rhythmic clatter of the loom that turned that thread into cloth, and the alchemical secrets of the dyer's vat that gave that cloth its color and value. We will see how the rugged, practical garb of the peasant remained almost unchanged for centuries, a uniform of toil dictated by function alone. In stark contrast, we will enter the rarefied air of the royal court, where fashion became a weapon, and a constant battle for prestige and power, governed by strict laws that dictated who could wear what, down to the very length of their shoes. We will travel with crusaders and merchants along the Silk Roads, discovering how contact with the East flooded Europe with new fabrics, new ideas, and a new obsession with luxury. This is a story of how simple, draped tunics evolved into tightly tailored garments that celebrated the human form, how armor became a canvas for artistic expression, and how an entire continent's economy could be built on the back of a sheep. We are about to dress the past, and we invite you to join us. The history of what we wear is a deeply personal one, and we'd love to know what you think is the strangest or most fascinating fashion trend from any period in history. Let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us build this community of historical exploration. And if you believe these stories are worth telling, please support us by liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into history. Now, let us pull back the first thread. Before any discussion of fashion, of shimmering silks or pointed shoes, we must begin at the very source. We must begin with a single, humble thread. The entire edifice of medieval society, its warmth, its comfort, its symbols of power, and its engines of trade, was woven from thread. The production of textiles was the most important manufacturing industry of the era, a universal and ceaseless activity that occupied a huge portion of the population, particularly women. The journey from a greasy fleece on a sheep's back, or a bundle of straw-like flax from the field to a finished piece of colored cloth was a long, arduous, and technically complex process. It was a foundational technology, as vital to medieval civilization as the plow or the sword, and it all began with the simple, magical act of spinning. The primary raw material for textiles in medieval Europe, particularly in the north, was wool. The importance of sheep cannot be overstated. They were a walking resource, providing meat, milk for cheese, and most crucially, a new fleece every year. But the raw fleece was a greasy, filthy mess, full of dirt, lanolin, and vegetable matter. The first step was to clean it through a process of washing and then carding or combing. Carding, used for shorter wool fibers, involved using two handheld paddles with wire teeth to brush the wool, disentangling the fibers and aligning them into a fluffy, airy mass called a rollag. Combing, used for longer fibers, involved pulling the wool through a large mounted comb to produce a smooth, uniform bundle of top-quality fiber. This preparation was crucial for the next stage, the bottleneck of the entire textile industry, spinning. For thousands of years, the primary tool for spinning was the drop spindle and distaff. The distaff was a simple stick onto which the prepared wool or flax fibers were loosely tied. The spindle was a weighted rod, often with a whirl at the bottom to give it momentum. The spinner, almost always a woman, would draw out a few fibers from the distaff, twist them together, and attach them to the spindle. She would then give the spindle a sharp twist, letting it drop and spin in the air. The spinning motion of the weighted spindle would twist the fibers together into a continuous, strong thread or yarn. The spinner had to constantly control the thickness and tension of the thread with her fingers, feeding more fibers from the distaff to create an unbroken strand. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic, and incredibly skillful process that required immense dexterity. It was also incredibly time-consuming. It is estimated that it took as many as 10 to 15 spinners working full-time to produce enough thread to keep a single weaver busy. This is why spinning was a near constant occupation for medieval women of the lower and middle classes. They spun while walking, while watching their children, while minding the cooking pot. The distaff and spindle were the universal symbols of womanhood and domestic industry. The introduction of the spinning wheel from the East, which began to appear in Europe in the 13th century, was a true revolution. A skilled spinner using a wheel could produce thread up to 10 times faster than with a spindle, helping to alleviate the great spinning bottleneck and making cloth more widely available. The second great textile fiber of the medieval world was linen. Linen is made from the fibrous stalks of the flax plant. Its production was even more laborious than wool. After harvesting, the flax had to undergo a process called retting, where the stalks were submerged in water for several weeks to allow bacteria to break down the woody core, leaving the strong, silky fibers behind. This process created a foul stench, and retting ponds were always located far from the village. After retting, the flax was scotched, beaten with a wooden blade to break away the rotted core, and then heckled, pulled through a series of increasingly fine iron combs to separate and clean the long linen fibers. These fibers were then spun into thread, just like wool. Linen was highly valued for its smoothness, strength, and absorbency. It was the primary fabric for undergarments, like the chemise for women and brise breeches for men, as it was far more comfortable against the skin than itchy wool. It was also used for coifs, veils, tablecloths, and bedding. Fine, white linen was a sign of cleanliness and status. Once the spinners had produced a sufficient quantity of thread, it was time for the weaver to begin his work. The dominant loom of the early Middle Ages was the warp-weighted loom. This was a large, upright wooden frame that would lean against a wall. The long threads of the warp were tied to the top beam and stretched downwards, held taut by heavy weights of baked clay or stone tied to their ends. The weaver would then pass the weft thread back and forth between the warp threads using a shuttle. After each pass, he would beat the weft thread upwards with a wooden sword or comb to pack it tightly, creating the cloth. It was a slow, physically demanding process. By the 11th and 12th centuries, a more advanced loom, the horizontal treadle loom, began to spread across Europe. This loom, likely another Eastern invention, allowed the weaver to sit and use foot pedals or treadles to raise and lower different sets of warp threads, creating a shed through which the shuttle could be passed much more quickly. This invention dramatically increased the speed and efficiency of weaving, allowing for the production of wider and longer bolts of cloth than ever before. It turned weaving from a largely domestic craft into a professional urban industry, creating the great cloth towns of Flanders and Italy. The cloth that came off the loom, known as grege goods, was a drab off-white or grayish material. Final stage which gave the cloth its value and beauty was dyeing. The medieval dyer was part alchemist, part craftsman, working with a complex and often foul-smelling array of ingredients derived from plants, insects, and minerals. The peasant's clothing was often undyed or colored with simple, locally sourced dyes that produced muted, earthy tones. Walnut husks produced shades of brown and yellow. Onion skins yielded a yellow-orange. The most common dye for the poor was weld, a plant that produced a vibrant yellow, and woad, a leafy plant that, through a complex fermentation process involving stale urine, produced a range of blues. Blue was the quintessential color of the working class, a sturdy, practical color that faded well. The rich, vibrant colors worn by the nobility were a sign of immense wealth, as they required expensive and imported dyestuffs. The most prized color was red. A brilliant, fiery scarlet was produced not from a plant, but from a tiny scale insect called kermes, which lived on oak trees in the Mediterranean. It took hundreds of thousands of crushed insects to produce enough dye for a single garment, making kermes red literally worth its weight in gold. Another source of red was madder root, which produced a range of brick reds and oranges. The most luxurious color of all was purple. The ancient Tyrian purple made from sea snails was lost to the west. Instead, medieval dyers could create a shade of purple by first dyeing the cloth with blue woad, and then overdying it with red from kermes or madder, a two-step process that made it exceptionally expensive. Green was also a luxury color, often achieved by first dyeing with yellow weld and then overdying with blue woad. The dyer's skill was to create a fast color, one that would not fade in the sun or run in the rain. To do this, they used a mordant, a chemical substance like alum, which helped the dye bind to the fibers of the cloth. From the fleece of a sheep to the finished, dyed cloth, the creation of textiles was a long chain of specialized skills. It was a world of female labor in the home and male labor in the professional urban workshops. It was a science of plants and chemicals, and an industry that drove the economies of entire regions. This cloth, whether it was a coarse, undyed peasant smock or a nobleman's scarlet cloak, was the fundamental canvas upon which the story of medieval fashion would be painted. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled and the first centuries of the Middle Ages began, the world of fashion did not experience a sudden, dramatic revolution. Instead, it underwent a slow, creeping transformation, a gradual fusion of late Roman civilian dress with the distinct clothing styles of the various Germanic peoples, the Goths, Franks, Vandals, and Anglo-Saxons, who were now the masters of Europe. The early Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1000 AD, was not an era of rapid fashion change or extravagant silhouettes. It was a world dominated by a single, practical, and remarkably versatile garment, the tunic, for both men and women, from the king on his throne to the peasant in the field. The tunic was the fundamental building block of the wardrobe, its length, material, and decoration a clear and immediate signal of the wearer's place in this new, fragmented world. The foundation of this early medieval style was the legacy of Rome, but it was the Rome of the later empire, not the classical era of the toga. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the impractical toga had been abandoned for daily wear in favor of the tunica, a simple T-shaped garment made of 2 pieces of cloth stitched together at the shoulders and sides, with holes for the head and arms. This was the garment inherited by the early medieval world. However, the incoming Germanic cultures brought their own clothing traditions, which were better suited to the colder, wetter climate of northern Europe. They brought with them a preference for layered clothing, for close-fitting trousers for men, and a greater use of wool and fur. The result was a hybrid style, a practical blend of Roman simplicity and barbarian functionality. For a man of this period, the basic outfit began with a linen undershirt or chemise, if he could afford it. Over this he wore his primary woolen tunic. The length of this tunic was a crucial status marker. For a free warrior or a nobleman, the tunic would typically be knee-length or slightly longer. A shorter tunic was associated with laborers and slaves, as it allowed for greater freedom of movement. The cut of these early tunics was simple and loose, designed for comfort and mobility rather than to show off the body's form. The sleeves were long and straight. Decoration was often concentrated at the neckline, cuffs, and hem, which might be adorned with woven bands of geometric patterns, a style known as tablet weaving, or embroidered with colored thread. For a king like Charlemagne, these bands would be incredibly elaborate, woven with gold thread and perhaps even studded with gems, elevating the simple tunic into a garment of imperial splendor. Beneath the tunic, men wore trousers. This was perhaps the most significant barbarian contribution to the European wardrobe. The Romans had viewed trousers, or bracca, as the quintessential garment of uncivilized foreigners. But for peoples from the colder climates of the north, they were a practical necessity. These trousers could be loose-fitting, like pajamas, or more often, tight-fitting leg coverings almost like thick stockings. To keep these close to the leg, they would often be cross-guarded long strips of leather or cloth would be wound around the leg from the ankle to the knee, a style clearly visible in depictions like the Bayeux tapestry. These leg coverings were not just for warmth, they were a sign of masculinity and martial prowess. The female wardrobe was built on similar principles of layering, but with a focus on modesty and a longer silhouette. A woman would begin with a long linen chemise as her base layer. Over this she wore a primary tunic or kirtle, which was always ankle length. Early Anglo-Saxon women wore a distinctive peplous-style gown, a sleeveless tube of cloth pinned at the shoulders with large ornate brooches. From these brooches they might hang strings of amber beads, glass, or personal items like keys and small knives. By the Carolingian period, this style had given way to a more universal sleeved tunic, similar to the man's but floor length. The woman's tunic was often belted high, just under the bust, creating a flowing, high-waisted silhouette. A key element of female dress was the head covering. For a respectable married woman, appearing in public with her hair uncovered was unthinkable. She would wear a veil or wimple, a piece of fine linen draped over the head and often wrapped around the neck and chin, completely concealing her hair. The quality of this linen and the complexity of its draping were indicators of her status. Over their tunics, both men and women wore cloaks for warmth and protection from the elements. The most common was a simple rectangular or semicircular cloak, pinned at one shoulder with a large functional and often highly decorative brooch, known as a fibula. These brooches were a primary form of artistic expression, intricately carved, with animal motifs, interlacing patterns, and inlaid with precious materials like garnet and gold. A man's cloak could double as his blanket on a military campaign, while a noble woman's cloak might be lined with expensive fur. Fur was a vital part of the early medieval wardrobe. While peasants might use sheepskin or rabbit fur, the aristocracy prized the pelts of animals like beaver, fox, and most luxuriously sable and ermine, the pure white winter coat of the stoat. An ermine-lined cloak was the ultimate symbol of royalty and high nobility. Footwear was simple and practical. Both men and women wore soft, slipper-like shoes made of leather, often with a single toggle or strap for fastening. There was little difference in style between the sexes. These shoes were made on a symmetrical last, meaning there was no distinction between the left and right foot, and they would have been quite comfortable but not very durable. The fabrics of this era were primarily wool and linen, produced domestically. The quality and fineness of the cloth were the most important indicators of wealth. A peasant wore hodden gray, a coarse, undyed wool that was rough and itchy. A nobleman wore broadcloth, a fine, dense wool that had been heavily processed fulled, teased and sheared to create a smooth, almost felt-like surface, a fabric that could hold a deep, rich dye. Silk was the ultimate luxury fabric, a near mythical substance that had to be imported at immense expense from the Byzantine Empire or further east. In the early Middle Ages, silk was so rare in Western Europe that it was used sparingly, perhaps for the decorative bands on a king's tunic, for church vestments, or as shrouds for the holiest of saints' relics. To be buried in silk was a sign of ultimate piety and power. For 500 years, this basic wardrobe of layered tunics remained remarkably stable. Fashion, as we understand it today, a system of rapid cyclical change, did not exist. The primary goal of clothing was to signify social rank in a clear and unambiguous way. You knew a man's status by the length of his tunic, the color of his cloak, and the fineness of his wife's veil. This was a world where clothing was a uniform, a visual representation of the rigid social order. The radical changes that would give birth to fashion, the rise of tailoring, the introduction of new fabrics from the East, and the explosion of conspicuous consumption were still centuries away. The post-Roman world was a world of tunics, a world where clothing was not about novelty, but about proclaiming your fixed and unalterable place in the great chain of being. While the fashions of the nobility would slowly evolve over the centuries, the clothing of the medieval peasant remained in a state of near perpetual stagnation. For 1,000 years, the basic garments worn by the man or woman working the fields were dictated not by style, but by the brutal realities of function, durability, and cost. The peasant's wardrobe was not a matter of choice or personal expression. It was a uniform of toil, a sparse collection of garments crafted to withstand the rigors of a life of hard labor and to provide basic protection from the elements. To study the clothing of the peasant is to study the history of pure utility, a world away from the whims of fashion that dictated the dress of their masters. The fundamental principle governing peasant clothing was economy. Every piece of cloth represented a significant investment of time and resources. The peasant's wife would have spent countless hours spinning the thread from the wool of their own sheep or the flax from their garden. The cloth she wove on a simple loom was precious. Therefore, garments were cut in the most economical way possible, using simple squares and rectangles to minimize any wasted material. The resulting clothes were loose, baggy, and shapeless, a bossy, stark contrast to the tailored garments that would later define aristocratic fashion. A peasant's clothing was designed to be worn for years, passed down from one child to the next, patched and repatched until it literally fell apart. For the male peasant, the essential garment was the tunic or smock. This was a simple T-shaped pullover, usually thigh-length, to allow for freedom of movement while bending and squatting. It was made from the coarsest homespun wool, a fabric known as hodden gray. This was the natural color of the black sheep's wool, a mottled gray or brown, which had the practical advantage of not showing the dirt. This rough, itchy wool was worn directly against the skin for most of the year. Underneath this he wore brise, a form of loose linen under trousers that gathered around the waist with a drawstring. In hot weather, a peasant might work only in his brise, a sign of his lowly status. Over his tunic he might wear a sleeveless jerkin of leather or thick felted wool for extra warmth and protection. His legs were covered with simple hose, not knitted stockings, but two separate tubes of cloth, each covering a leg, which were tied to the drawstring of his brise to hold them up. His feet were clad in simple, functional footwear, rough leather-turned shoes, or, for the poorest or in summer, wooden clogs, or nothing at all. The peasant woman's clothing was constructed on the same principles. Her primary garment was a long, ankle-length tunic or kirtle. It was voluminous and shapeless, belted at the waist with a simple cord. This loose fit was practical, accommodating the physical changes of pregnancy and allowing for a full range of motion for tasks like milking, a cow tending the garden, or leaning over the hearth. Like the man's tunic, it was made of coarse, undyed wool. Underneath she wore a simple linen chemise or shift, which was her most intimate garment, serving as both underwear and nightgown. A married woman would never be seen in public without her head covered. Her hair would be braided and pinned up, and then covered with a simple linen veil or a wimple, a cloth wrapped around the head, neck, and chin. This was not just a matter of fashion. It was a powerful symbol of modesty and marital status, enforced by the church and social custom. The materials themselves tell a story of poverty and resourcefulness. The peasant's wool was of poor quality, full of coarse hairs, unlike the fine, soft wool from the Lord's selectively bred flocks. It provided excellent insulation, even when wet, but it was incredibly itchy and rough against the skin. Their linen, used for undergarments, was also a coarse, unbleached variety, a far cry from the fine white Holland cloth worn by the aristocracy. Every scrap of fabric was precious. When a garment became too worn to be patched again, it would be cut up and repurposed. Larger pieces could be used to make children's clothes. Smaller pieces became patches, and the final, tattered remnants would be used as cleaning rags or even as bindings for wounds. Nothing was wasted. Color, or the lack thereof, was the most visible marker of a peasant's status. The complex and expensive dyeing processes were far beyond their means. Their world was one of earth tones, the gray and brown of undyed wool, the off-white of unbleached linen, and the muted yellows and browns from simple dyes made from local plants like weld or walnut husks. The one common, vibrant color was blue, from the woad plant. Woad was grown throughout Europe and was relatively inexpensive, producing a sturdy, practical color that was less prone to fading than many other vegetable dyes. A blue tunic or kirtle was a common sight in the medieval village, a splash of color in an otherwise drab world. The peasant's wardrobe had to function across the seasons. In the summer, a man might work in just his linen brise, and a woman in her simple chemise. In the winter, they did not have different styles of clothing, but simply added more layers. A man might wear a second tunic over the first, a thick woolen cloak, and perhaps a simple cap or hood of wool or sheepskin. They might stuff their shoes with straw or moss for extra insulation. Their clothing was a simple, functional system. For thermoregulation, devoid of any concept of seasonal fashion. This unchanging uniform of toil served a powerful social purpose. It made the peasant instantly recognizable. Their rough, earth-toned, shapeless garments visually separated them from the other orders of society. When a lord or a wealthy merchant, dressed in brightly colored, well-fitted clothes, rode through a village, the visual contrast was immediate and stark. It reinforced the natural order of things, the idea that God had ordained a place for everyone, and that one's clothing should reflect that station. The peasant's garb was a symbol of his bond to the earth, a constant reminder of his life of physical labor. While the fashions of the court might change with dizzying speed in the later Middle Ages, the peasant's tunic, brise, and kirtle would remain a timeless uniform, a testament to a life lived in concert with the seasons and in service to the soil. It was the clothing of endurance, of fashion that did not change because the life it was designed for did not change. To leave the world of the peasant and enter the world of the medieval aristocracy is to step from a monochrome landscape into a riot of dazzling, almost unbelievable color. For the nobleman and noblewoman, clothing was not primarily about function or durability. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a public declaration of their power, wealth, and impeccable lineage. The medieval court was a theater, and fashion was its primary language. The richness of a fabric, the intensity of a color, and the sheer extravagance of a silhouette were all weapons in a relentless social competition. This explosion of conspicuous consumption became so extreme that the authorities, both secular and religious, felt compelled to intervene, creating a complex web of laws designed to control the very colors and materials people could wear. The foundation of noble dress was the quality of the fabric. While a peasant made do with coarse homespun, the aristocracy wore the finest textiles the world had to offer. Their wool was not the itchy fabric of the commoner, but luxurious broadcloth, sourced from the finest fleeces of England or Spain, and woven by master craftsmen in the great cloth towns of Flanders. This wool was subjected to a long and expensive finishing process. It was full pounded in water with clay to make it thicker and more felt-like. Then the surface was raised with teasels and meticulously sheared to create a perfectly smooth, almost seamless surface that felt like velvet to the touch. This high-quality broadcloth was the perfect canvas for the dyer's art, capable of holding the deepest and most vibrant colors. Color was the most immediate and potent signal of wealth and status. The muted, earthy tones of the peasantry were replaced by a palette of brilliant, saturated hues derived from rare and costly dye-stuffs. The undisputed king of colors was scarlet. True scarlet was not just a shade of red. It was a specific, incredibly expensive type of cloth dyed with kermes, the tiny Mediterranean insect. A nobleman dressed head to toe in scarlet was making an unambiguous statement of immense wealth, a statement as powerful as building a castle. Other rich reds from the madder plant were also popular. Deep, vibrant blues, a world away from the common woad blue of the peasant, were achieved by using high-quality woad in a more complex, multi-stage dyeing process. Greens, often associated with youth and springtime, were created by first dyeing the cloth yellow with weld, and then overdying it with blue, a costly double process. But the ultimate color of power, reserved for royalty and the highest ranks of the clergy, was purple. The secret of Tyrian purple from sea snails had been lost to the west, but a similar shade could be achieved by the even more extravagant process of dyeing a cloth with hideously expensive kermes red and then overdying it with woad blue. This color was so rare and so deeply associated with the emperors of Rome and the robes of cardinals that it was a color few dared to wear. The second great luxury fabric was silk. For most of the Middle Ages, silk was imported from the Byzantine Empire or via the Silk Road from even further east. It was a fabric of almost magical properties. It was lightweight, incredibly strong, and had a unique luster that seemed to shimmer and change in the light. In the early medieval period, it was used sparingly for decorative elements. By the 12th and 13th centuries, with the opening of new trade routes during the Crusades and the establishment of silk weaving industries in Italy, it became more widely available to the high nobility. Nobles wore gowns of pure silk, or silk blended with linen or wool. They favored figured silks, like damask with its woven patterns, and the ultimate luxury, silk velvet, a fabric with a deep, plush pile that was incredibly complex to weave. Even more extravagant was cloth of gold, a fabric woven with real threads of gold or silver wrapped around a silk core. To wear cloth of gold was to literally wear money, the most audacious display of wealth imaginable dot as the Middle Ages progressed. Particularly after the 14th century, noble fashion became increasingly extreme and ostentatious. This was the age of the fashion victim, driven by a desire to display wealth and differentiate the nobility from the rising merchant class. Men's tunics became shorter and tighter, while their hose became skin-tight, often made of two different, brightly colored fabrics, one for each leg. The points of their shoes, known as poulaines or krakows, grew to absurd lengths, sometimes requiring a chain to be tied from the point to the knee to avoid tripping. They wore elaborate hats and hoods, and their sleeves, known as tippets, became long, trailing streamers of fabric that served no practical purpose whatsoever. Women's dress became equally extreme. The opulent, a voluminous floor-length gown with enormous, pendulous sleeves that almost touched the floor, became the height of fashion. It was often lined with fur and made from yards and yards of expensive velvet or brocade. Headwear for women also reached bizarre extremes, with towering, conical hats known as hennins, from which floated long, transparent silk veils. These fashions were deliberately impractical. They demonstrated that the wearer lived a life of pure leisure, completely removed from the world of physical labor. This explosion of competitive spending and extreme fashion deeply worried the authorities. The Church condemned these fashions as evidence of pride, vanity, and lust, the devil's work designed to lead souls to damnation. Kings and princes had a more practical concern. They saw fashion as a threat to the social order. If a wealthy merchant's wife could dress in the same fabrics and colors as a duchess, how could one tell them apart? How could the divinely ordained social hierarchy be maintained if it was not clearly visible in people's dress? The solution was a wave of legislation known as the Sumptuary laws. These were detailed laws designed to regulate consumption, specifically what people of different social classes were permitted to wear. The laws were incredibly specific. An English law of 1363, for example, stipulated that laborers and servants could only wear simple cloth worth less than 2 marks per bolt, and their wives could not wear any veil made of silk. It dictated that esquires and gentlemen below the rank of knight could not wear cloth of gold or cloaks lined with ermine. Knights could wear more expensive cloth, but not velvet or ermine. Only earls, dukes, and those of higher rank were permitted to wear the most luxurious fabrics. Similar laws were passed across Europe, regulating everything from the length of a shoe point to the amount of fur trim allowed on a sleeve dot in reality. These laws were almost impossible to enforce and were widely ignored. They were, in effect, a testament to their own failure. The very fact that they had to be passed so frequently demonstrates that the rising merchant class and lower gentry were eagerly adopting the fashions of their social superiors, using clothing as a tool for social mobility. The sumptuary laws were a desperate attempt by the old aristocracy to maintain a visual monopoly on power in a world where new money was beginning to challenge the old order. They were a legal expression of the fundamental belief that clothing was not a personal choice, but a public statement of one's place in society. For the medieval nobility, fashion was a battlefield. Colors were their banners, and fabrics were their armor in a constant war for social supremacy. For much of the early Middle Ages, Western Europe was a relatively isolated and provincial place. Its fashions were dominated by local materials like wool and linen, and its knowledge of the wider world was limited. But beginning in the late 11th century, a series of events kicked open the doors to the East, unleashing a flood of new materials, ideas, and luxuries that would permanently alter the course of European fashion. The Crusades, the armed pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and the subsequent flourishing of trade routes like the legendary Silk Road brought Europeans into direct, sustained contact with the sophisticated and opulent cultures of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The returning Crusaders and the enterprising merchants who followed in their wake brought back more than just relics and spices. They brought back a new taste for luxury and the very fabrics of Eastern splendor. The First Crusade, launched in 1095, was the primary catalyst. Tens of thousands of European knights, nobles, and their followers undertook the long and arduous journey to the Levant. Their destination was not just a holy site, but a region that stood at the crossroads of the world's great civilizations. In cities like Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem, these relatively unsophisticated Westerners were confronted with a level of luxury and refinement that was almost beyond their comprehension. They were dazzled by the Byzantine court, where the emperor and his attendants seemed to be literally dressed in gold and shimmering silk. They encountered the emirs and sultans of the Islamic world, whose courts were centers of scientific knowledge, poetry, and breathtaking artistic production. When these crusaders established their own kingdoms in the Holy Land, they adopted many of the local customs and luxuries. They built castles that incorporated Eastern defensive designs. They developed a taste for citrus fruits, sugar, and spices, and they began to dress in the magnificent textiles of the region. A knight who had left France wearing a simple woolen tunic might return years later wearing a flowing robe of Damascus silk, lined with fine cotton and perfumed with exotic scents. They brought back these garments, and more importantly, they brought back a desire for them. The stories they told and the treasures they displayed created a huge demand among the European aristocracy for the products of the East. The most coveted of these products was silk. While small amounts of silk had trickled into Europe before, the Crusades and the establishment of Italian trading posts in the eastern Mediterranean opened the floodgates. Silk was desirable for its incredible luster, its strength, and its lightweight comfort, especially in warmer climates. But it was also the canvas for the most sophisticated weaving and dyeing techniques in the world. Islamic and Byzantine weavers were masters of creating figured silks, fabrics with complex patterns woven directly into them. European nobles were captivated by fabrics like damask, which used a special weaving technique to create subtle, reversible patterns of flowers or geometric shapes. Even more desired was brocade, where extra weft threads of gold or silver were woven into the silk fabric to create glittering, opulent designs. These patterns often featured exotic and stylized animals, lions, eagles, griffins, or intricate geometric and calligraphic motifs derived from Islamic art. To wear a gown of Byzantine or Persian silk brocade was to wear a piece of wearable art, a symbol of immense worldliness and wealth. Another fabric that was introduced to Europe during this period was cotton. While linen and wool dominated in the north, cotton had been cultivated in the warm climates of Egypt, Persia, and India for centuries. It was a soft, breathable, and highly absorbent fiber. The Crusaders encountered it in the Levant and Ware. Impressed by its comfort. They brought back raw cotton and finished cloth, and soon centers of cotton cultivation and production began to spring up in European regions with suitable climates, like Spain and southern Italy. Cotton was used to make fustian, a sturdy cloth with a linen warp and a cotton weft, which was used for padding and lining. Pure fine cotton, known as muslin, was imported from the city of Mosul in modern-day Iraq and was highly prized for its softness. Used for fine undergarments and veils. This influx of new materials was accompanied by a revolution in dyeing. The dyers of the East had access to a wider range of dye stuffs and more advanced techniques than their European counterparts. They were masters of creating vibrant, fast colors. The brilliant Hermes red, the deep indigo blues, and the saffron yellows of Eastern textiles set a new standard for luxury, and this created a demand that spurred European dyers to improve their own techniques and to seek out new trade routes to acquire these precious dyestuffs. The city of Venice, in particular, grew fabulously wealthy by dominating the trade in Eastern goods, including spices, dyes, and luxury textiles, which it then sold at an enormous markup to the rest of Europe. The influence was not just in the materials, but also in the style of the garments themselves. The basic European tunic began to be supplemented by new Eastern-inspired garments. The ceaseless was a simple, sleeveless surcoat, often made of silk, worn over armor partly to protect the mail from the sun and rain, but also as a canvas for displaying a knight's coat of arms. This idea of wearing a decorative layer over armor was a direct borrowing from the military dress of the Middle East. The concept of buttons, while not unknown in Europe, became much more widespread after contact with the East. Buttons allowed for a much tighter, more form-fitting garment than the old system of belts and brooches, a development that would be crucial for the tailoring revolution of the 14th century. The turban, a classic feature of Middle Eastern dress, was occasionally adopted by fashionable European men and women as an exotic and worldly form of headwear. The Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, despite its terrifying invasion of Eastern Europe, had the unintended consequence of making these trade routes even more secure. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, created a stable and secure environment for merchants to travel the vast distances of the Silk Road, from the Mediterranean to China. This period saw an unprecedented flow of goods and ideas in both directions. It was during this time that the Italian merchant Marco Polo made his famous journey, and the tales he brought back of the immense wealth and sophistication of the court of Kublai Khan only further fueled the European appetite for Eastern luxuries. Fabrics and patterns from as far away as China began to appear in the wardrobes of European monarchs. This flood of Eastern influence had a transformative effect on European fashion. It created a new culture of luxury and consumption among the elite. It spurred the development of domestic industries like silk weaving in Italy, as European craftsmen sought to replicate the magnificent fabrics they were importing. It expanded the vocabulary of color and pattern, introducing a new level of visual complexity and opulence to noble dress. Most importantly, it broke Europe out of its relative isolation, permanently connecting the wardrobe of a French duchess or an English king to the looms of Damascus, the cotton fields of Egypt, and the silk-producing regions of China. The simple, Woolen tunic of the early medieval lord was gone forever, replaced by a globalized costume that was a testament to the new age of trade, travel, and international exchange. For the first 800 years of the Middle Ages, clothing had served primarily to cover the body, not to reveal it. The dominant garment, the tunic, was a loose, draped T-shape, designed for economy of fabric and ease of movement. It concealed the natural lines of the human form beneath its folds, but beginning in the late 12th century and accelerating dramatically through the 13th and early 14th centuries, a radical new idea began to take hold in the courts of Europe. This was the idea of fit, driven by new technologies, new social ambitions, and a changing sense of self. A revolution in clothing construction occurred. The simple seamstress gave way to the master tailor, a craftsman who could cut and shape fabric to sculpt the body, to accentuate its lines, and to create a silhouette that was no longer draped but structured. This was the birth of tailoring, and it marks the true beginning of fashion as we understand it today. The primary technological innovation that made this revolution possible was the widespread adoption of the button. Buttons had existed for centuries as decorative ornaments, but their use as functional fasteners became common in Europe from the 13th century onwards. Before buttons, garments had to be loose enough to be pulled on over the head. They were secured with belts, ropes, and pins. Buttons, however, allowed for a garment to be opened and closed along its entire length. This meant that clothing could now be cut to fit the torso with unprecedented tightness and precision. A row of closely spaced buttons running down the front of a man's tunic or the sleeve of a woman's gown was not just a functional closure. It was a visible symbol of this new modern style of dress and a declaration of wealth, as buttons were often made of expensive materials like bronze, silver, or carved bone. This new technology of fit was first and most dramatically applied to men's clothing. The old, knee-length, loose-fitting tunic began to be replaced by a new garment, the coat-hardie. The coat-hardie was a revolutionary piece of clothing. It was cut to be exceptionally tight-fitting across the chest, shoulders, and waist, hugging the torso like a second skin. It often featured a long row of buttons running from the neck to the waist, and another row running from the elbow to the wrist, creating a tight, tailored sleeve. This close fit served to show off a man's physique, his broad shoulders and narrow waist, a silhouette that was considered the masculine ideal. At the same time, the skirt of the coat-hardie became dramatically shorter, rising from the knee to the mid-thigh. This shortness was seen as shocking, even scandalous, by more conservative chroniclers, who railed against the vanity and immodesty of young noblemen. This new, shortened tunic exposed the legs in a way that had not been seen before. This, in turn, drove an evolution in men's legwear. The old, separate tubes of cloth known as hose tied to the undergarment's drawstring were no longer sufficient. To create a smooth, unbroken line, the two separate legs of the hose were joined together at the top, evolving into a garment that was essentially a pair of medieval tights. This required skillful cutting of the cloth on the bias, diagonally, to the grain of the weave, which allowed the fabric to stretch and fit the legs snugly without bagging or wrinkling. A nobleman's hose became a canvas for conspicuous display, often made of two different, vibrant colors. a style known as party-colored or mi-parti, where one leg might be scarlet red and the other deep blue, often reflecting the colors of his family's coat of arms. The tailor's art was not just about cutting the cloth, it was about shaping the body. Padding and quilting, techniques learned from the construction of armor undergarments, began to be used in civilian dress. A man's doublet, the garment that would eventually replace the cotardie, might have its chest and shoulders padded with raw wool or cotton to create an exaggeratedly broad, powerful silhouette, the pouter pigeon chest that was considered the height of masculine fashion. This manipulation of the body's natural shape through padding and structure was a radical departure from the draped clothing of the past. It was the birth of anatomical, three-dimensional construction in clothing. Women's fashion underwent a similar, if slightly more modest, revolution. The loose, high-waisted kirtle of the early Middle Ages was replaced by a new style of gown that also emphasized a tight fit in the torso. The woman's cotardie was long, often with a train that pooled on the floor, but it was cut to be extremely tight-fitting through the bust, waist, and hips. Achieving this smooth, figure-hugging line without wrinkles required incredible skill. From the tailor, who used a complex system of curved seams and gauze triangular panels of fabric, inserted into the skirt to create the desired shape. This new silhouette was long, lean, and elegant, with a low neckline that exposed the neck and shoulders. The sleeves were also a focus of attention, often buttoned tightly from the wrist to the elbow. From the elbow hung long, decorative streamers of fabric known as tippets, a purely non-functional element that signaled the wearer's life of leisure. This new emphasis on fit and form created a demand for a new kind of craftsman. The tailor was no longer just a seamstress who stitched together rectangles of cloth. He became a master artisan, a revered expert in geometry, anatomy, and design. The secrets of his trade, the patterns and cutting techniques were jealously guarded. The rise of the Tailors' Guild in cities across Europe is a testament to the growing importance and prestige of this profession. A nobleman or a wealthy merchant would not just buy cloth. He would employ a personal tailor to create custom-fitted garments that were unique to his body and his taste. This was the beginning of bespoke fashion. What drove this radical change? It was a combination of social and cultural forces. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the rise of a wealthy urban merchant class who were eager to display their newfound wealth and challenge the old aristocracy. Fashion became a key battleground. For social status, a merchant could signal his success by adopting the tight-fitting, brightly colored styles of the nobility. This, in turn, pushed the nobility to adopt ever more extreme and extravagant fashions to visually differentiate themselves, creating a cycle of rapid fashion change. There was also a new sense of individualism emerging in the culture, a greater interest in the human body and personal identity. The tight-fitting clothes of the tailor's revolution were a reflection of this new consciousness, a move away from concealing the body toward celebrating and even exaggerating its form. The draped, anonymous tunic of the past gave way to a garment that was sculpted to the individual, a wearable expression of a person's unique physical and social identity. This was the moment when clothing stopped being just a covering and started being fashion. If the 13th and early 14th centuries saw the birth of tailoring, the period that followed from roughly 1350 to the end of the 15th century saw that art taken to its most fantastical, bizarre, and logic-defying extremes. This was an age of sartorial spectacle, where the clothing of the elite seemed to break free from the constraints of the human form, creating strange and wonderful new silhouettes designed to shock, awe, and display wealth on an unprecedented scale. Driven by the social chaos following the Black Death, the rise of powerful new ducal courts, and an insatiable appetite for novelty, the fashion of the late Middle Ages became a theater of the absurd. It was an age of towering hats, voluminous sleeves, and, most famously, impossibly long, pointed shoes. The psychological impact of the Black Death cannot be overlooked as a driver of this new extravagance. In a world where life was unpredictable and often short, the survivors, particularly the newly enriched, adopted a live for today mentality. This translated into a desire for ostentatious display, a way of celebrating life and flaunting one's good fortune. At the same time, the old social order was in flux, and the aristocracy felt a desperate need to reassert its visual dominance over the rising merchant class. The result was an arms race of fashion, where every new style was quickly pushed to its most extreme and impractical conclusion. For men, the tight-fitting coat-hardy gave way to the even shorter doublet, or pourpoint, a padded and quilted garment that barely reached the hips. This extreme shortness placed the man's legs, clad in skin-tight hose, on full, dramatic display. But the true focus of masculine extravagance was often what was worn over the doublet, the houppelande. The houppelande was a magnificent, voluminous outer gown, often full length, with a high collar and, most characteristically, enormous pendulous sleeves. These sleeves were a pure statement of conspicuous consumption. They might be funnel-shaped, bagging, or cut into fantastical shapes like leaves or daggers, a style known as dagging. They were often lined with contrasting colored silk or expensive fur. They served absolutely no practical purpose. They were simply a way of displaying yards and yards of hugely expensive fabric. A man wearing a houppelande with sleeves that trailed on the ground was making it clear that he did no form of manual labor. But no feature of this period is more iconic or more bizarre than the pointed shoes known as poulaines or krakows. The fashion for pointed toes began in the 14th century, but reached its zenith in the 15th. The points, or pikes, grew to extraordinary lengths, sometimes extending 6 inches, a foot, or in the most extreme cases 2 feet beyond the wearer's toes. These points were often stuffed with moss or wool to keep their shape. For the longest pikes, a delicate gold or silver chain was sometimes attached from the point to a garter below the knee, simply to make walking possible. The poulaine was the ultimate symbol of aristocratic leisure and non-functionality. It was impossible to run, to work, or to fight in these shoes. They were a pure fashion statement, and their length was often regulated by sumptuary laws. A prince could wear a longer point than a baron, who could wear a longer point than a mere knight. The church, predictably, condemned them, seeing them as devilish and phallic, but this did little to dampen their popularity among the fashion-conscious elite. Women's fashion was equally, if not more, architecturally ambitious. while women also adopted the houppelande with its voluminous fabric and trailing sleeves. The most dramatic and gravity-defying element of their costume was their headwear. This was the age of the hennin. The hennin was a towering, conical or steeple-shaped hat, often resembling a dunce cap, that was worn perched on the back of the head. It could be a foot or even 2 feet high. The hennin itself was constructed from a frame of wire or cord covered in expensive fabric like silk or velvet. From its peak, a long diaphanous silk veil would float down, often reaching to the ground. To wear a hennin, a woman's forehead and hairline were often plucked and shaved to create a high, smooth and fashionably egg-like brow. The sheer height of the hennin meant that a noble woman had to move carefully and deliberately, bowing her head to pass through doorways, a constant performance of aristocratic grace. The hennin was not the only form of extreme headwear. The horned or forked headdress was another popular style, where the hair was braided and looped up over the ears into 2 large horns, which were then covered by a silk veil or a jeweled net called a caul. This style was also heavily condemned by moralists who compared women wearing it to horned beasts or devils. These elaborate headdresses were part of a larger aesthetic that reshaped the female silhouette. The combination of a high shaved forehead, a towering headdress, a tight-fitting bodice that flattened the chest, a low belt that created a pregnant-looking S-curve in the torso, and a long train that trailed on the floor created a look that was highly stylized, elegant, and completely divorced from the natural human form. This era was also characterized by a love of heraldry and personal symbolism. In dress, the party-colored style, with garments split into 2 or more different colors, was immensely popular. A nobleman might wear a doublet and hose, where one side was the color of his own family's coat of arms, and the other was the color of his wife's family, a visual representation of a dynastic alliance. This period also saw the rise of livery, a specific uniform of color and badges worn by the household and retainers of a great lord. The wars of the 5th-10th century, like the Wars of the Roses in England, were fought by armies clad in the livery of their patrons, the red and white of the Tudors, the white rose of York. Clothing was a political and military uniform as much as it was a fashion statement. The courts of Burgundy, under powerful and art-loving dukes like Philip the Good, became the great fashion capitals of 5th-10th century Europe, the equivalent of modern-day Paris or Milan. It was here that these extreme styles were pioneered and promoted. The Burgundian court's preference for dark, rich colors like black, deep blues, and burgundies, executed in luxurious fabrics like silk velvet, set the tone for aristocratic dress across the continent. This was a fashion of pure spectacle, a deliberate and theatrical attempt to create an image of overwhelming power and otherworldly magnificence. The pointed, padded, and trailing silhouettes of the late Middle Ages represent the final, flamboyant flowering of the aristocratic ideal, before the cultural shifts of the Renaissance would usher in a new, more classical and naturalistic aesthetic. It was an age when fashion was truly fantastic. In our exploration of medieval fashion, we have discussed the soft power of silk and the declarative authority of scarlet cloth. But there was another form of dress, one worn exclusively by the elite, that was the most expensive, most technologically advanced and most powerful fashion statement of all, a suit of armor. We often think of armor as purely functional military hardware, separate from the world of civilian fashion. This is a profound misunderstanding. For the medieval knight and nobleman, his armor was his most important garment. It was a status, symbol of staggering expense, a canvas for artistic expression, and a carefully constructed silhouette that often mirrored and influenced the fashionable clothing worn at court. The evolution from a simple mail shirt to a magnificent, glittering suit of full plate was not just a military arms race. It was a fashion arms race where a knight's survival on the battlefield was inextricably linked to his prestige in the Great Hall Dot in the early Middle Ages. The standard defense of a warrior was the byrnie or mail shirt. This was a tunic made of thousands of interlinked iron rings. Each ring was painstakingly riveted shut, creating a strong, flexible garment that was highly effective at defending against the slashing cut of a sword. A mail shirt could take hundreds of hours to produce and was a significant investment. Worn over a padded under tunic called a gambeson or accaton, which provided crucial shock absorption, and paired with a conical steel helmet with a nasal guard. This was the classic look of the Norman knight at the Battle of Hastings. It was a practical, if heavy, defense, but it offered limited protection against the piercing thrust of a lance or the crushing blow of a mace. For several centuries, this basic formula remained the standard. Improvements were made. Male leggings, or chausse, were added, as were male mittens and coifs to protect the neck and head. But the great transformation began in the 13th and accelerated in the 14th century, driven by the increasing power of weapons like the crossbow and the couched lance. Knights began to add rigid plates of steel to protect the most vulnerable parts of their bodies over their mail. At first, these were simple boiled leather or iron plates for the knees, pellins, and elbows counters. Then came greaves to protect the shins. Gradually, more and more plates were added. Breastplates, vambraces for the forearms, and gorgets for the throat. For a time, knights wore a transitional form of armor, a fabric surcoat worn over a mail shirt, with these new plates attached either over or under the cloth dot. The true revolution culminated in the 15th century with the development of the full suit of plate armor. This was the pinnacle of the armorer's art, a complete head-to-toe exoskeleton of articulated steel plates. It was an object of breathtaking beauty and technical sophistication. A full suit of white armor, as the polished steel was known, was custom-made to fit its wearer perfectly. It consisted of dozens of interconnected pieces, each with a specific name and function, all held together by a complex system of internal leather straps and rivets. A well-made suit of plate armor, contrary to popular myth, was not impossibly heavy or cumbersome. Weighing between 45 and 55 pounds, its weight was distributed so evenly over the body that a trained knight could run, mount his horse, and even perform a somersault. The design was a masterpiece of engineering, with overlapping, articulating plates that allowed for a remarkable range of motion, while presenting a glancing, angled surface to deflect blows. This full-plate armor was far more than just protection. It was high fashion. The silhouettes of the great 15th century armors, crafted in the famous workshops of Milan in Italy or Augsburg in Germany, directly mirrored the fashionable civilian styles of the day. For example, the Gothic style of armor, popular in Germany, was characterized by slender, elegant lines, fluted and ribbed surfaces that were not just decorative but added strength, and sharply pointed sabatons, the steel shoes that perfectly mimicked the absurdly pointed poulain shoes worn at court. A knight's armor was his courtly dress for the tournament and for war, and it had to be just as fashionable as his velvet houpelande. The expense of a full suit of high-quality plate armor was astronomical. A common soldier might earn in his entire lifetime what a nobleman spent on his armor. In the 15th century, a good Milanese suit could cost more than a country estate. This immense cost ensured that full-plate armor was the exclusive preserve of the super-rich, the highest ranks of the nobility. It was the ultimate Veblen good, an item whose primary function was to signal the immense wealth of its owner. A king or a great duke would own multiple suits, a heavy, reinforced suit for jousting in the tournament, a lighter suit for fighting on foot in judicial duels, and a field harness for the chaos of battle. Beyond its basic form, armor became a canvas for lavish decoration. The plain polished steel could be embellished in numerous ways to increase its beauty and prestige. It could be blued or blackened through heat treatment to create a dramatic dark finish. It could be etched with acid to create intricate patterns of foliage, religious inscriptions, or heraldic symbols. Most luxuriously, it could be gilded, with shimmering gold applied to the edges of the plates or across entire surfaces, creating a suit of golden armor fit for a king. The helmet, in particular, was a focus of personal expression. In the tournament, a knight would top his great helm with a crest, a large, three-dimensional sculpture made of lightweight wood, leather, and gesso. This crest could be a representation of his heraldic badge, a lion, an eagle, a dragon, or a more fanciful device, like a lady's glove or a castle. This, combined with the colorful painted shield and the horse's heraldic trappings, or barding, turned the mounted knight into a living, breathing emblem of his lineage and identity. The tournament was the great theater where this armor was displayed. The joust, a one-on-one contest between two mounted knights, became the ultimate chivalric sport. Knights would compete for honor and for prizes, wearing specialized, heavy jousting armor designed to withstand the shattering impact of a lance. These tournaments were major social events, attended by noble ladies who would give their favor a scarf or a sleeve to their chosen champion. The pageantry and spectacle of the tournament, with its heralds, trumpets, and glittering suits of armor, was a highly ritualized form of warrior fashion show. The age of full-plate armor, however, was destined to be short-lived. The same technological advancements in gunpowder that were making the stone castle obsolete were also beginning to challenge the supremacy of the knight on the battlefield. While early firearms were inaccurate and slow to load, and a good suit of plate could deflect a musket ball, the writing was on the wall. The future of warfare lay not with the elite armored individual, but with disciplined ranks of infantry armed with pikes and firearms. By the 16th and 17th centuries, full-plate armor became increasingly ceremonial, worn for parades and portraits, a nostalgic symbol of a bygone chivalric age. But at its peak in the 15th century, the suit of armor represented the perfect synthesis of art, technology, and fashion. It was the most potent symbol of the medieval aristocratic identity, a warrior, a nobleman, and a man of immense power, clad head to toe in a second skin of sculpted, glittering steel. Beneath the glittering surface of aristocratic fashion and the stoic functionality of peasant garb, a powerful economic engine was transforming the social and sartorial landscape of the Middle Ages. This was the great wool trade. For centuries, the production and trade of wool and woolen cloth was the cornerstone of the European economy, the medieval equivalent of the modern oil industry. It was a vast international network that connected the sheep pastures of England and Spain to the weaving workshops of Flanders and the finishing vats of Florence. This trade created immense fortunes, fueled the growth of powerful cities, and gave rise to a new and ambitious social class, the urban merchants and clothiers. This new class, with its vast disposable income, would become a major force in the world of fashion, using their wealth to challenge the old nobility and to express their own distinct identity through the clothes they wore. The undisputed center of raw wool production, the Saudi Arabia of wool, was medieval England. The English climate and geography were perfectly suited for raising sheep, and English wool, particularly from regions like the Cotswolds, was prized above all others for its long, fine, and strong fibers. English landholders, from great monasteries to secular lords, realized that raising sheep for wool was far more profitable than traditional subsistence farming. This led to the controversial process of enclosure, where common lands were fenced off to create vast private sheep runs, often displacing peasant communities. The wealth generated by this wool was so crucial to the English crown that the Lord Speaker in the House of Lords traditionally sits on a ceremonial cushion stuffed with wool, known as the woolsack, a powerful symbol of the source of the nation's power. This raw English wool was then packed into massive sacks and exported across the Channel to the great cloth-producing cities of Flanders, places like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. These cities became industrial powerhouses, their entire economies dedicated to the art of turning raw wool into finished luxury cloth. Here, a highly organized system of guilds controlled every stage of production. The wool was combed and carded, spun into thread by legions of workers, and then woven into cloth on the new, efficient horizontal looms by the master weavers. The Flemish were renowned for the quality of their weaving, producing dense, heavy broadcloths that were the envy of Europe. From Flanders, these unfinished bolts of cloth were often transported once again, this time south, to the great finishing and dyeing centers, particularly Florence in Italy. The Florentine guilds, like the powerful Arte di Calimala, specialized in the final value-adding stages. They were masters of finishing the cloth, a process of fulling, shearing, and pressing that gave it its smooth, luxurious feel. More importantly, they were masters of dyeing, using expensive and exotic imported dye stuffs like kermes and alum to create the vibrant, lasting colors demanded by the luxury market. A single bolt of cloth could crisscross Europe several times, gaining value at each stage, before ending up as a finished garment in the wardrobe of a nobleman or a wealthy burgher. This immense industry created a new class of men who were not born into the landed aristocracy, but who could, through skill and enterprise, accumulate wealth on a scale that rivaled and sometimes surpassed that of the old nobility. These were the great wool merchants, the clothiers, and the bankers who financed the trade. They became the urban elite, the patricians who governed the newly powerful cities of Bruges, Florence, and London. And like any new elite, they were eager to display their success. Their primary method of doing so was through their clothing. The fashion of the successful merchant was a careful balancing act. He wanted to project an image of wealth, stability, and sober piety, in contrast to what he might see as the frivolous and decadent extravagance of the court. His clothing was typically made from the very finest quality woolen broadcloth, often in dark, rich, and respectable colors like deep blue, crimson, or by the 15th century, a very expensive and fashionable black. While a courtier might wear a short, revealing doublet, the merchant often preferred a longer, more substantial gown, lined with fur. But the fur would not be the ermine reserved for royalty. It would be the thick, warm fur of beaver or squirrel, a sign of practical wealth rather than inherited privilege. His wife would be dressed with equal splendor, her gown made of the finest cloth, her belt adorned with silver gilt, and her head covered with fine imported linen. The portraits of wealthy merchants and their wives from this period, like Jan van Eyck's famous Arnolfini portrait, are meticulous studies in the textures and details of bourgeois fashion, advertisements for the sitter's wealth and social standing. This sartorial challenge from the merchant class did not go unnoticed by the aristocracy. The proliferation of sumptuary laws in the 14th and 15th centuries was a direct response to this phenomenon. The old nobility, whose power was based on land, saw their visual distinctiveness being eroded by the new money of the cities. The laws that forbade a merchant from wearing velvet or certain types of fur were a desperate attempt to legislate taste and to keep the visual markers of the social hierarchy clear and legible. However, the sheer wealth of the top merchants often allowed them to ignore these laws or to find loopholes. Paying fines as a form of luxury tax. The wool and cloth trade did more than just create a new fashion-conscious class. It fundamentally reshaped the economic and political landscape of Europe. It fueled the growth of cities, creating vibrant centers of commerce, art, and innovation. It led to the development of sophisticated new financial instruments, like bills of exchange and international banking, to manage the complex, long-distance trade. It was a source of constant political friction, particularly between England and France. The English crown's reliance on wool taxes and its close economic ties to the cities of Flanders were major contributing factors to the outbreak and continuation of the 100 Years' War. The control of the wool trade was a high-stakes geopolitical game. The wealth generated by this trade also became a major source of artistic and architectural patronage. Wealthy cloth merchants would commission magnificent portraits of themselves and their families, build impressive stone townhouses, and donate lavishly to their local churches, funding the construction of new chapels, altars, and stained glass windows. In these windows they would often be depicted as donors, dressed in their finest clothes, ensuring that their piety and their wealth would be remembered for generations. The great wool trade, therefore, was the invisible thread that connected the shepherd in the English countryside to the weaver in Bruges and the banker in Florence. It created a new powerful urban class whose sober yet luxurious fashion sense stood as a proud testament to their success, a challenge to the old aristocratic order, and a clear signal that a new, more commercial world was being woven from the simple fleece of a sheep. Throughout our journey, we have seen that medieval clothing was a powerful indicator of wealth and social standing, but its role went far beyond a simple declaration of riches. The medieval wardrobe was a complex, codified language, a visual system of signs and symbols that everyone, from the illiterate peasant to the learned cleric, was taught to read. Every choice of color, every piece of jewelry, every heraldic device, and every vocational robe told a story. Clothing was the social contract made visible, a way of communicating one's lineage, loyalties, profession, and moral standing without speaking a single word. To dress in the Middle Ages was to participate in a silent, continuous conversation about one's precise place in the ordered universe. The most formal and explicit use of clothing as language was the science of heraldry, born on the chaotic battlefields of the 12th century, where knights encased in mail and helmets were otherwise indistinguishable. Heraldry was a system of unique visual emblems, a coat of arms that identified a specific individual, family, or lineage. These arms were displayed on the shield, but they quickly migrated to clothing. The surcoat, a sleeveless garment worn over armor, became the primary canvas for displaying one's arms, turning the knight into a walking banner of his identity. This practice soon moved from the battlefield to the court. A nobleman would wear a tunic or a gown emblazoned with his heraldic devices, making his identity and, more importantly, his lineage instantly recognizable. Women, too, participated in this language. A noblewoman's gown was often impaled, with the heraldry of her father's family displayed on one half of the dress and the arms of her husband's family on the other, creating a single garment. That was a living document of a dynastic marriage and the merging of two great houses. This system of identification extended beyond the individual to the entire household. A great lord, duke, or king maintained a large retinue of retainers, servants, and soldiers. To unify this group and display the lord's power, the concept of livery was developed. Livery was a specific uniform, usually in the bold colors of the lord's coat of arms, distributed to his followers. A retainer in the household of the Duke of Lancaster would be instantly recognizable in his red and white garments. This was a powerful tool of social cohesion and political might. It turned a lord's followers into a walking army, a visible manifestation of his influence. In the fractious politics of the late Middle Ages, such as the Wars of the Roses in England, livery became a source of immense public disorder. Bands of liveried retainers loyal only to their own lord would intimidate local courts, terrorize rival tenants, and fight street battles, turning towns into battlegrounds. The crown repeatedly tried to stamp out the practice of livery, seeing it as a direct threat to royal authority, but the power of clothing as a uniform of political loyalty was too strong to be easily broken beyond the secular world of the aristocracy. Clothing served as a powerful uniform of vocational identity. The clergy of the Catholic Church had the most ancient and complex system of symbolic dress. From the simple, rough brown habit of a Franciscan friar, a deliberate statement of poverty and humility, to the magnificent silk and gold embroidered vestments of a bishop celebrating Mass, Clerical clothing was a detailed language of spiritual rank and liturgical function. The white alb, the colorful stole, the chasuble worn for the Eucharist, and the cope worn for processions were all steeped in centuries of symbolism. The bishop's mitre and crozier were direct visual translations of his authority as a shepherd of his flock. The stark black robes of a Benedictine monk or the pure white of a Cistercian instantly communicated their order and their commitment to a life lived apart from the world. This was not fashion. It was a sacred uniform, a set of garments that effaced the individual and elevated the office. The nascent universities, which grew out of the cathedral schools, developed their own form of vocational dress. The scholar or master at Oxford, Paris, or Bologna wore a long, sober gown known as a capa clausa, or closed cope. This was a practical garment, providing warmth in the unheated stone halls of the university, but it was also a symbol. The dark, unadorned robe marked the scholar as a man of serious intellectual pursuits, distinct from the frivolous, brightly colored fashions of the court. The hood, which could be pulled up for warmth, had its colors and linings codified to indicate the wearer's faculty and the level of his academic degree. This is a tradition that survives to this day in the academic robes worn at graduation ceremonies, a direct and visible link to the medieval university. Even the world of commerce had its own sartorial codes. The members of the powerful craft and merchant guilds would often wear specific livery on feast days and for civic processions, distinguishing the goldsmiths from the fishmongers or the weavers. A successful merchant, as we have seen, would adopt a style of dress that communicated his wealth through the quality of the fabric and the richness of the fur lining. But his choice of a long, sober gown over a short, flamboyant doublet was a conscious statement of his identity as a serious, pious, and trustworthy man of business. Beyond these formal systems, individual colors and garments carried a rich symbolic weight that was widely understood. Green was the color of youth, springtime, and love. Blue was often associated with fidelity and faithfulness. The Virgin Mary was almost always depicted in a blue mantle, making it a color of heavenly grace. Red could signal martial power or the holy fire of martyrdom. White symbolized purity and innocence, while black, which was incredibly expensive to dye properly, became a color of both solemn dignity and elite, fashionable power in the Burgundian court. Even the state of one's clothing spoke volumes. Patched clothing on a peasant was a sign of poverty and thrift, but deliberately torn or slashed clothing, a fashion that emerged at the end of the period, where cuts were made in the outer garment to reveal the fine linen or silk lining underneath, was a daring and audacious display of wealth. It showed that the wearer was so rich they could afford to destroy their expensive clothes for pure decorative effect. Moralists and preachers were also adept at reading the language of clothes, though they interpreted it as a manual of sin. They railed against the long, pointed poulaines of men as devil's fingers, reaching out to trip souls on their way to hell. They condemned the low necklines of women's gowns as gates to perdition, and the towering hennin headdresses as symbols of prideful vanity. For these commentators, fashion was a moral battleground, and every new trend was a new temptation sent by the devil. Their sermons reveal how closely clothing was scrutinized, and how every element of a person's dress was believed to be a direct reflection of their inner moral state. This intricate visual language, understood by all, was what made the sumptuary laws seem so necessary to the ruling class. In a world where a man's worth and place were meant to be fixed and God-given, the idea that a wealthy commoner could simply purchase the visual signifiers of a nobleman was deeply subversive. It threatened to make the language of clothes incoherent, to blur the divinely ordained lines between the social orders. The language of medieval clothing was, therefore, more than just a matter of aesthetics. It was a fundamental tool for structuring society, for communicating identity, and for navigating a world where who you were was inseparable from what you wore. We have spent a great deal of time exploring the visible world of medieval fashion, the magnificent gowns and the powerful suits of armor that dominated the social landscape. But beneath these outer layers lies a hidden history, an unseen wardrobe, that was in many ways more important to the daily life and health of a medieval person than any silk brocade or velvet houppelande. This is the story of undergarments, maintenance, and the constant, laborious battle for cleanliness. The popular imagination paints the Middle Ages as an era of profound filth, where people lived and died without ever washing themselves or their clothes. The reality is far more nuanced and reveals a society deeply concerned with purity, both spiritual and physical, where the whiteness of one's linen was the ultimate measure of personal hygiene and social respectability. The cornerstone of this unseen wardrobe for every social class above the most destitute was linen. While wool was the workhorse fabric for outer garments, its rough, itchy texture made it uncomfortable against the skin. Linen derived from the flax plant was smooth, absorbent, and relatively easy to wash. It formed the critical barrier between the dirty outer world and the body itself. For men, the basic undergarments consisted of brise, a type of loose-fitting linen shorts or trousers that gathered at the waist with a drawstring, and a simple T-shaped linen shirt often called a smock or chemise. For women, the primary undergarment was a long, ankle-length linen gown called a chemise or shift. This was her most intimate piece of clothing, serving as her underwear by day and her nightgown by night. These linen undergarments were the key to medieval hygiene. The wealthy might own many sets of them, changing them daily. Even a peasant family of modest means would strive to own at least 2 sets, one to wear, while the other was being washed. The core concept of cleanliness was not necessarily about washing the body frequently, but about wearing a clean linen layer next to the skin. The linen would absorb the body's sweat and oils, protecting the valuable and difficult-to-clean woolen outer garments from becoming soiled. A person's cleanliness was judged by the visible evidence, the slivers of clean, white linen peeking out at the neckline and cuffs of their tunic or gown. A crisp, white chemise was a sign of good housekeeping, diligence, and social standing. A grimy, yellowed neckline was a mark of sloth and poverty. This emphasis on clean linen presupposed a colossal amount of labor, and that labor fell almost exclusively to women. The Great Wash was a monumental, physically demanding task undertaken, not daily, but perhaps monthly, or even less frequently. We must banish the modern idea of soap. While rudimentary soaps made from animal fat and wood ash existed, they were a luxury item used for personal washing by the rich, not for laundry. The primary cleaning agent for medieval laundry was lye. Lye is a powerful alkaline solution created by trickling water through a barrel of hardwood ash. The resulting liquid was a potent caustic degreaser. The dirty linen would be soaked in vats of this lye solution, often with stale urine added for its ammonia content, which acted as a bleaching agent. After soaking, the clothes were subjected to a process of brutal physical agitation. They would be taken to a river or stream and beaten against the rocks or with large wooden paddles, known as laundry bats. This was the medieval equivalent of the washing machine's agitator, designed to force the dirt out of the fibers. The clothes were then rinsed thoroughly to remove all traces of the lye and laid out on bush or grassy banks to be bleached by the sun. For the finest, whitest linen, this process would be repeated multiple times. It was an entire day, or several days, of backbreaking, foul-smelling work. This is why outer garments made of wool were almost never washed. Submerging a complex woolen garment in water would cause it to shrink, lose its shape, and ruin the vibrancy of its expensive dyes. The maintenance of these precious outer garments was a separate, but equally important, chore. They were regularly brushed with stiff brushes to remove surface dirt and dust. They were aired frequently, hung outdoors in the sun and wind to remove odors. Stains were spot-treated with a variety of substances depending on the nature of the stain and the color of the fabric. Grease might be treated with absorbent clay, while wine stains might be treated with salt or milk. The fight against pests was a constant battle. Moths, fleas, and lice were a fact of life. Clothes were stored in wooden chests, and wealthy households would use chests made of cedar wood, whose aromatic oils naturally repel insects. Bundles of fragrant, dried herbs like lavender, rosemary, southernwood, and wormwood were placed among the stored clothes to perfume them and deter pests. Personal hygiene, too, played a role. While full immersion bathing was not a daily activity, people regularly washed their hands and faces. Public bathhouses or stews were common in medieval towns, offering hot baths, steam rooms, and often less savory entertainments. However, their association with prostitution and the later belief that opening the pores in hot water could let in the plague led to their decline in the 15th century. For most, hygiene was centered on that critical layer of clean linen. The symbolic power of these undergarments was immense. The act of a knight putting on a clean white linen shirt before donning his armor was a ritual of purification. The white robes worn by a child at baptism or a novice entering a monastery were powerful, symbols of a soul wiped clean of sin. Conversely, the hair shirt was a type of penitential undergarment, a coarse, abrasive shirt made from animal hair, worn secretly by the pious to mortify their flesh and remind them of Christ's suffering. It was the ultimate inversion of the comfort and purity that linen was meant to provide, the unseen wardrobe. Therefore was a world of intense labor and profound social and spiritual meaning. The simple linen shift was the foundation of the entire medieval fashion system. It protected the luxurious outer garments. It enabled a standard of hygiene that, while different from our own, was deeply important to the people of the time, and it served as a visible testament to a person's diligence and respectability. The whiteness of your linen was the truest measure of your worth. a clean foundation upon which the entire colorful edifice of medieval fashion was built. A garment, no matter how finely tailored or richly colored, was only the foundation of a medieval person's appearance. The true expression of their identity, personality, and status was often found in the intricate ecosystem of accessories and embellishments that completed the look, from the jeweled belt that cinched the waist to the jaunty feather in a cap. These objects were far more than mere decorations. They were a rich and complex part of the sartorial language, imbued with practical function, symbolic meaning, and immense social power. These were the finishing touches that transformed a simple outfit into a powerful statement, communicating a wealth of information about the wearer's life, loyalties, and innermost self. The most important and universal accessory for both men and women was the belt or girdle. In a world of loose, flowing garments and no pockets, the belt was an essential and multifunctional piece of equipment. At its most basic level, it served to cinch the tunic or gown at the waist, creating shape and providing support. But it was also the medieval equivalent of a tool belt or a handbag. From the belt, a person would hang all the necessary items for their daily life. A man might hang his purse, a set of keys, a sharp utility knife in a leather sheath, and perhaps a small whetstone. A woman, particularly the lady of a great household, would suspend her keys from her belt as a powerful symbol of her domestic authority. She might also carry a small decorative knife for eating, a pomander, a ball of fragrant spices to ward off bad smells, or a rosary. Because of its prominent position, the belt quickly became a primary site for displaying wealth. While a peasant's belt was a simple leather strap or a woolen cord, an aristocrat's belt was a magnificent piece of jewelry. These were often made of fine leather or woven silk brocade, and adorned with a series of ornate, cast metal plaques known as bar mounts. The buckle itself could be an elaborate sculpture of silver or gold, sometimes decorated with enamel or set with precious stones. The end of the belt, the chape which hung down from the buckle, was also heavily decorated. To wear a belt worth more than a peasant's entire cottage was a casual, everyday display of immense status. Since clothing had no pockets, the purse or aumônière was another essential accessory. These ranged from simple leather drawstring pouches to incredibly elaborate embroidered silk bags. The aumônière was not just for carrying coins. It was also a symbol of Christian charity. The name derives from alms, and a wealthy individual was expected to carry a purse from which they could distribute alms to the poor. As such, these purses were often decorated with pious scenes or heraldic devices, becoming a vehicle for displaying both one's wealth and one's virtue. Gloves were another powerful status symbol, laden with meaning. For the nobility, wearing gloves was a sign of high birth and a life free from manual labor. They protected the hands, keeping them soft and pale, which was the aristocratic ideal. Gloves were often made of fine kidskin or deerskin and could be perfumed with scents like musk or ambergris. They were essential for the noble sport of falconry, with thick leather gauntlets used to handle the birds of prey. Gloves also played a key role in social and legal rituals. To give someone your glove was a sign of trust and favor. To throw down your gauntlet, a metal-plated glove from a suit of armor, was a formal challenge to a duel, a gesture of mortal combat that has survived. In our language to this day, perhaps no accessory was more varied or more important for signaling identity than headwear. A person's hat or headdress was an instant indicator of their age, marital status, and profession. For women, as we have seen, the veil or wimple was a near-universal sign of modesty and marriage. But beyond this, a huge variety of hats existed. Men of all classes wore the coif, a simple, close-fitting linen cap that tied under the chin, often worn under another hat. The hood was a versatile garment attached to a short cape, which could be worn down or pulled up for warmth. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the hood evolved into a complex and fashionable headdress called the chaperon, where the face opening was placed on top of the head and the long tail, or liripipe, and cape were artfully draped and twisted. Wealthy merchants and sober professionals often favored tall hats made of beaver fur, a warm, waterproof, and very expensive material. Feathers, particularly ostrich and peacock feathers, became a popular and flamboyant addition to men's hats in the later Middle Ages. Another expensive imported luxury used to signal fashion consciousness. Jewelry was, of course, a primary way to display wealth and status. Brooch or fibulae, which had begun as large, functional pins to fasten cloaks, evolved into purely decorative objects of immense beauty. They could be circular, star-shaped, or even formed into elaborate pictorial scenes, and were covered, and pearls, gemstones, and intricate enamel work. Rings were worn by both men and women on every finger and even on the thumbs. A signet ring engraved with a personal or family crest was used to press into hot wax to seal official documents, making it a crucial tool of business and administration. Other rings might be devotional, inscribed with the names of saints or given as tokens of love. Necklaces or carcanets were also popular, ranging from simple strings of amber or jet beads to massive, heavy gold chains worn by powerful noblemen. Finally, the medieval person often adorned their clothing with a variety of badges and signs that communicated their allegiances and experiences. The most common were pilgrim badges. A person who had completed a pilgrimage to a major shrine, like the tomb of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury or St. James at Santiago de Compostela, would purchase a small, mass-produced pewter badge as a souvenir and proof of their journey. These badges, a scallop shell for Santiago, a tiny bell for Canterbury, would be proudly pinned to a hat or cloak. They were a sign of the wearer's piety, their worldliness, and their physical endurance. In a more political vein, the late Middle Ages saw the rise of the livery badge. This was a metal badge bearing the symbol of a great lord, the bear and ragged staff of the Earl of Warwick, the white hart of Richard II, which was distributed to his retainers. Wearing a lord's badge was a public declaration of loyalty, a promise of patronage and protection, and in a turbulent age, a dangerous political alignment. From the functional necessity of a belt and purse to the pure, decadent fashion of a jeweled brooch or a feathered cap, accessories were the vital finishing touches of the medieval wardrobe. They allowed for a level of personalization and detailed communication that the main garments alone could not provide. They were a microcosm of the medieval world itself, a world of faith, function, and fierce social competition, where every small object was laden with meaning, and a person's identity was constructed and displayed piece by glittering piece. We began our journey with a single thread, the fundamental element that built the textile world of the Middle Ages. We have followed that thread as it was spun, woven, dyed, and tailored, and we have seen it transform from a peasant's humble tunic into a queen's magnificent hoopland. We have discovered that clothing in the medieval period was never just a simple matter of covering the body. It was a complex and powerful language, a visual tapestry that communicated a person's entire identity, their wealth, their status, their profession, and their relationship with God. The story of medieval fashion is a story of how society itself was structured, a tale woven on the loom of legacy. We have explored the foundational technologies of this world, the near-constant domestic labor of spinning and the professionalized urban craft of weaving and dyeing, which turned the raw materials of wool and flax into the essential cloth of civilization. We have seen how the post-Roman world created a practical hybrid wardrobe based on the versatile tunic, a garment whose length and quality was an immediate indicator of social rank. We have walked through the fields with the peasant, clad in his unchanging uniform of toil, his rough, earth-toned smock, a testament to a life of function over form. In stark contrast, we have entered the glittering, competitive theater of the royal court, where fashion was a weapon. We saw how brilliant, expensive colors like scarlet and fabrics like silk became symbols of immense power, leading the authorities to pass sumptuary laws. In a desperate attempt to police the visual hierarchy. We have traveled with crusaders and merchants on the roads to the east, witnessing how the influx of new materials like silk and cotton and new ideas like the button revolutionized the European wardrobe and sparked a new appetite for luxury. This led us to the tailor's revolution, the pivotal moment when clothing ceased to be merely draped and became sculpted, when the concept of fit was born and the human form was celebrated and accentuated for the first time. We saw this revolution taken to its fantastical extremes in the pointed age of the late Middle Ages, with its impossibly long shoes, towering headdresses, and voluminous sleeves, a deliberate and theatrical performance of aristocratic leisure. We have seen how a suit of armor was the ultimate fashion statement for a nobleman, a custom-fitted, technologically advanced, and artistically embellished second skin. We have understood how the entire system was fueled by the immense wealth of the great wool trade, which created a new and powerful merchant class. We have learned to read the intricate language of clothing, where a heraldic device, a sober robe, or a specific color could speak volumes about a person's identity and allegiances, and we have uncovered the unseen wardrobe of linen undergarments and the immense labor of cleanliness, and adorned our subjects with the jewels, badges, and belts that completed their look. The specific silhouettes of the Middle Ages, the hoopland, the hennin, the poulain may be gone, confined to museums and historical reenactments. But the fundamental principles and legacies of medieval fashion are still with us, woven deeply into the fabric of our modern lives. The idea that clothing is a primary signifier of our identity, that what we wear communicates who we are and where we belong, was solidified in this period. The concept of fashion itself, a system of cyclical change driven by social competition and a desire for novelty, was born in the medieval court. The textile technologies they perfected and the trade networks they established laid the foundations for the modern global fashion industry. The names of fabrics like damask from Damascus, remind us of the medieval trade routes that connected our world. Even the fundamental structures of our clothing, the use of curved seams, set-in sleeves, and button closures, are a direct inheritance from the innovations of the medieval tailor. The sober suit of the modern businessman is a distant echo of the respectable gown of the medieval merchant, just as the academic gown worn at graduation is a direct link to the medieval scholar's robe. The brand logo on a modern handbag serves the same function as the livery badge on a 5th-10th century retainer's tunic. It signals allegiance and identity. To study the clothing of the past is to understand the people who wore it, their hopes, their fears, their ambitions, and their beliefs. The fabric of their society was not just a metaphor, it was a literal reality. From the peasant's patched tunic to the king's ermine-lined cloak, every garment tells a story. It is a story of power, of faith, of technology, and of the enduring human need to craft an identity and present it to the world. The loom of the Middle Ages may have stopped, but the threads it wove continue to shape our world today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the medieval wardrobe. We believe that history is found not just in great battles, but in the intimate details of daily life. If there is another aspect of history you would like to see us unravel, please share your ideas in the comments below. We are always inspired by our community's curiosity. If you found this documentary valuable, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the past. Until next time, stay curious.